she still Googled me to make sure I was fast enough for her. So she looked up all my Strava data and she looked up my past and took a picture of me. She goes, okay, he's decent looking. I think I can deal with this guy.
Chris, you got the right kind of pedigree, right? You can hold X amount of watts on the bike for 3 hours and you're good to go. Hello, and welcome to CEO Authors, the show where leaders share their stories, strategies, and ideas that drive success. I'm your host, Carl Taft, and today is it Christopher or Chris?
Let's go with Chris.
All right, 10-4. Yeah. And before we get into stuff, is there anything off the table that we shouldn't be talking about?
No.
Okay. What other question? Are you still a triathlete?
I am. We just got back from Florida with my wife who did the 70.3. I was the Sherpa this weekend, but yeah, I've done a bunch of Olympics and 3 halves. My wife's done 7 fulls and about 40 halves. She and I met on fitness singles. I was a widow and she was divorced, and she's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's back up a little bit on this. So that's really good, actually. So let me.
Okay.
I want to get into that because I'll share some things on me, and we'll just get into that. So I view this as just FYI. So before I do this, is there anything you want to promote specifically? I want to make sure I'm helpful for you.
Well, I do have this book, Honest to Goodness: Why Christianity Needs a Reality Check and How to Make It Happen. It's the 4th book I've written. And it's one of a series of 2 so far that focus basically on authenticity and our sources of truth. But I have anecdotes that really are more real world and would relate those back to some of the things I did. We don't need to get into the weeds on the theology, but some of the fact that I focus on is honesty leads to goodness.
Yeah, we're in Texas. That can be a touchy subject for people, but I still want to touch on it because I like it. Like I was listening to one of your podcasts as you're walking through nature. You mentioned, and so just keep this in mind, like, trading goodness for power, I think is what you talked about.
Right.
And I think in light of like where AI is headed, and it's either going to be, the savior for humanity or it's going to be the Antichrist. And I just something there, maybe we'll see how the conversation takes us. Okay, great. And then you said 4 books. So I have The Right Kind of Pride, Honest to Goodness, Not Far to Fall, Nature is Our Country Club, The Genesis Fix.
Yeah, we don't have to mention Not Far to Fall. That book was an experimental publishing effort when I first went on to Amazon, but the other 4 are there. Yeah.
Okay. Great. So let's just hop right in and just have it be conversational. Okay?
I love it.
Like I met you at the airport lounge or whatever, and you're going to a destination.
I talk to people all the time at the airport, so we're good.
Great, man. Great. And Merry Christmas. Yeah, I don't know, Happy
Very
Hanukkah,
so.
whatever. But okay, here we go. Well, hello and welcome to CEO Authors, the show where we explore the ideas leaders share with the world and the experiences that shape them. Today, our guest is Christopher Cudworth, writer, artist, triathlete, and creative leader. Much of what he writes about is shaped by significant life experiences, it seems like, that have forced him to slow down, reassess priorities, and think deeply about responsibility, pride, and what it means to care well for others. Chris, welcome to the show.
I love that intro. That is pretty much my belief system in a nutshell. So thank you.
Yeah. We're talking a little bit before getting into this, and I read somewhere that I took it to mean like you're kind of a product of all your prior experiences, right? Culminating to present. Can you take a moment and maybe give our listeners a background of yourself? I think they would appreciate that.
So I come from a pretty athletic background, but I've always had an interest in the arts and writing. And so I've tried to combine those 2 across the scope of my life. But I also was married 28 years to a woman who, in about 45 years old, experienced ovarian cancer. And over that 8 years, I blogged to a caregiving community and shared our experiences. And one of the things that it taught me over time was the importance of authenticity and honesty. And as it happened, there were so many people that gathered around us to help us that I said, wow, this is sort of a blessing. It's sort of like the whole activity of sort of crowdsourcing care. And so I thought about this, and when I was first going into this, the woman who ran the uh, preschool where my wife worked called me up and said, "Guess what? We're all going to help you, uh, but we want to let you know that we'll let you in the girls' club. But the girls' club has one rule: you have to be honest with us and tell us everything, or you're out of the girls' club." And I liked that, and it taught me the importance of vulnerability. In other words,
Mm,
being willing to share the truth about yourself and people come around you. And I have another quick anecdote about this because while I was in and out of work taking care of her, because sometimes she needed profound care. And the first thing that happened was my longtime coach called me up and said, "Hey, you know what? Your whole life's been a preparation for this." In other words, all the athletic tests and the pressures and handling stress and managing yourself, even though I have some ADHD, it all comes together in this sort of moment. And then crazy things happen, really neat things happened. I was taking care of her one night. I got her home from chemo. I brought her to the kitchen and I said, I'll fix you something quick to eat and get you to bed. She goes, "No, we need to sit down and add up the bills." Right? Because, that matters. And so we sat down. She says, looks like we need $3,500 this month. And I said, "Honey, something always comes along." I said, "I always get something freelance." And she goes, "Well, let's say a little prayer." So we said a little prayer. I got her off to bed. And the next morning I got up early to make her oatmeal because I kind of sucked at it, right? I'd make it too dry or too wet. And so I just
yeah.
combined the two. And we had this door slot that would open up in the front. It made a squeak noise. And because of our caregiving group, people would bring us, cookies and chicken soup and cards and encouragement. And that morning I heard thump and I went out and I looked down and I picked up this thick envelope and there was $3,700 in cash. And I said in the book, I said, you could say that that was a coincidence and you'd be correct. But you could also say it was an answer to a prayer and you'd be correct. And what I found is most of us live in that in between. We have to do the things day to day
Yeah.
that we need to survive
Yeah.
and pay the bills. But there are times when we run into things that are sort of beyond our scope of immediate reason. The way I put it, I'm a very rational person and I try to always find the best data to make decisions. But sometimes when you're under stress, you don't know the answers. But then you
Oh,
have to be open, right?
oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen a lot of what you do, and I wanna maybe talk about, like, maybe a common theme or maybe feeling in your life. I you so I didn't talk about it. You're a triathlete. What length of triathlons do you do?
So that has continued after my wife passed away.
Yeah.
I was a widow, and I decided after a little bit that I might try dating. And actually, her best friend had told me, "You know what? Linda told me that she knew that you likely date her. She passed away because you need companionship." And I was like, "Well, thank you for telling me that. I'm glad I made some of my own decisions." But I met
Right.
my wife on fitness singles, and I was already a
Yeah.
runner and competitive cyclist.
Yeah.
So I already had those two things, but she still Googled me to make sure I was fast enough for her. So she looked up all my Strava data and she looked up my past and took a picture of me. She goes, "Okay, he's decent looking. I think I can deal with this guy."
Chris, you got the right kind of pedigree, right? You can hold X amount of watts on the bike for 3 hours and you're good to go.
Yeah. And so at first, I didn't do triathlons. I did do athlons. And the first time I came off the bike, or actually, yeah, I ran, I came off the bike, and those first 30 to 50 seconds are torture, right? Your legs are dead. And she looked at me and she goes, "Keep going, honey," because I had this look of partial panic on my face. And all of this sort of feeds into what I have always thought of. I call it the transfer of excellence. In other words, when you're trying to do these events, especially endurance events, which I've done all my life, there's sort of a discipline you learn. There's sort of an honesty to it. Kenny Moore, the Olympic marathoner, wrote, "Running is hard, clean, and severe." And it is a no excuses kind of activity. And triathlon's much the same. Even though we all analyze our races afterwards and go, "I could have done this better, I could have done that better."
Yeah.
Transition, why was it 7 minutes?
Yeah.
Those kinds
Yeah.
of things.
Yeah.
So I do those because I like the peak experience aspect of it.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
doing something that really raises your consciousness, and I love that.
Yeah, there it is. That's what I thought you were gonna say. I used to do halves. I've done 3,
Mhm.
eons ago, but there is something to be said about being in the zone and just kinda clipping along, and so I see you walking in the forest. Say you're a triathlete, you're a writer, you're an artist. I've seen some of your murals. There's a lot of outdoor subjects, it looks like, a lot of
Mhm.
depth and pretty big projects. I feel like you're not addicted, but you're drawn to that mindset. Can you talk to that? Maybe I'm off base, maybe I'm not. I mean, what's your thoughts to that?
Super example right there because that is entirety. I have been since a little kid interested in wildlife and art and nature, and I've sold more than 3,000 paintings, mostly of wildlife and landscape and that sort of thing. And most of my writing is about those subjects too. And yes, when I need to recharge, yes, you go out and ride and you go out and run, but I've gotten done with rides where I go, wow, I don't remember much about that ride. You know, you're so focused on everything. And instead, when you go out in nature, what you find is that they talk about, many great writers have talked about this, that your mind opens up. And I've seen more than 500 species of birds and all that kind of thing from all my bird watching. And I do wildlife censuses and things like that.
Mhm,
And it
mhm.
takes you out of this whole busy, busy mindset that we all engage in.
Yeah, but I gotta ask, so the type A, wanna rule the world business addict that I am, uh, you gotta make it a priority or you don't do it,
Mhm, mhm.
right? Like, it's really hard for me to dissociate. Have you ever struggled with that? I'm just curious.
So I've given a number of talks about this very topic. I originally did it for a women's business group, and it was called Nature is the Ultimate Stress Reliever. And stress is all the unanticipated forces that impact us in life.
Yeah,
And it could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be mental, it could be business. I spent 40 plus years in the marketing communications world, and you're always on deadline. And I
yeah,
wrote as an editorial writer, you're always on deadline. And so, what nature offers you really is this one, there are actually physical benefits to it. Even they've said that there's certain kinds of oxygen in the forest actually fuel us, that there's our origins as people really bring about these feelings in us. And the smell of spring rain, they say that there's actually chemicals in spring rain that
yeah,
reduce stress in you.
believe
And
it.
so I gave this talk and tried to encourage people and say, yes, you probably would do well to plan it. It can just be a walk with your dog in the morning, though, you
Yeah,
know, and
yeah.
going out. Although when I walk both dogs, it's usually not too relaxing. So I'm learning to walk one at a time because they're both after different
Yeah,
sniffs.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's a good word for life in general, different sniffs, right?
Yeah, right, right, right. Yeah, I see that more and more just in my circle of friends, right? I live here in Dallas, and the common theme. Well, I don't know if it's common, but I hear it a lot, which is I got to get to nature. I got to get to
Mm.
nature, right? And just people are like looking for that. And I'm from Hawaii, Big Island actually. So for your
Oh, okay.
triathletes out there, I watched a lot of world championships growing up. But
Oh,
yeah,
neat.
it's that idea of getting into nature, it's being zen. I even tell our sales guys, right? Like teaching, you can teach a lot of things, but you can't teach somebody what the ocean smells like,
Mhm.
right? You have to experience it. You can't like learn it, if you will.
My favorite thing to do is take
Yeah.
people out into the field. Um, Usually medium groups, 10 to 15
Yeah.
max with binoculars. And some people have never looked through binoculars or seen through a spotting scope. And it can be simple, something simple, even like a great blue heron, which
Mm,
a very common bird. But when people see up close the sharpness of the eye and the length of the beak and the
yeah.
filigree of those feathers coming off the back of their head, I see their jaws literally drop. And that is something that really means a lot to me to share that. That I bring into also in my writing. So one of the things I did many years back was I've always been involved in Christianity, but I have sort of a practical, very organic faith. And one of the things that I write about is that when we read the Bible in 60, actually 90 days one time, you had to read 12 pages a day. And it was sort of like that running thing you're talking about. It was sort of a discipline. But things popped out at me. And one of the things that really hit me strongly, even after all the years of Sunday school and church and leading Sunday school and all that, was that all throughout scripture, the leading symbols for spiritual aspects, the rock, the dove, the lamb, the tree of life, the river of life, are all based in nature. And when we think about it, we think about how, for example, Jesus taught. He used parables all the time that were based on things like the mustard seed and the yeast in the dough. And his disciples challenged him, said, "Why do you do this?" He goes, "Listen, with you, I give it to you straight." He goes, "But for them, they need to realize that all of this is accessible to them in their everyday life." And that to me sort of talks to this whole point that nature is important. And if you want to call it creation is important. And there are great examples in writers, even Martin Luther, the great Reformationist guy, said, God is in the trees and all that. And there are people who object to that and say, well, God isn't nature and nature isn't God. That's not my point. The point is that throughout the Bible, what you see is clear examples of this and how it accesses it. And there's not this dichotomy between scripture and our real lives. And I just like that. And I try to share that with people when I go out. I'm not a proselytizer that way. I don't
Mhm.
try to educate or challenge people when we're out in the field. But if someone asks, that sort of thing, I think that's a good way to explain it. And so I appreciate you being willing to share that with people too. When I wrote my first book, The Genesis Fix, I
Yeah.
had a professor of religion at Luther College. I went to Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. Beautiful place. And he used to take people up into the boundary waters in wintertime to have these experiences in nature.
Yeah.
And he was one of the original members of the Dead Sea Scrolls Committee that interpreted all this ancient Hebrew into English.
Mhm.
And when he read my book, he sent me a manuscript a few months later. First, he said, "I really like what you're writing. And here's this book. I'm never going to publish it, but you can use any or all of it." And it was called Religion from Earth. So when you're talking about this idea that uh, nature is good for us, he was talking about the fact that, yes, that's an access point. Not that you're talking directly to God, but that it releases something in you or it gives you that experience that takes you out of that day to day grind experience and that sort of thing. So when I've been in meetings with CEOs and with presidents and that sort of
Yeah.
thing, and they're so focused on this thing that they need to get done, the bottom line and that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
once in a while, for example, I was sitting at the 36th floor of the Hancock Center one time in Chicago, and I looked out the window, and up in front of the window floats a peregrine falcon.
Hmm.
And they breed and live in Chicago
Right.
because they are basically installed there. And I
Yeah.
pointed out the window and I explained a little bit about peregrine falcons, and I could see just for a moment these guys that were more focused on the bottom line going, wow, that's kind of cool. But then it was right back, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
at least they got a dose of that, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've had a couple of guests on, prior to this show, and I'm trying to put my thumb on how do you find that place? Or how do you get to that
Mhm,
place, right? The calmness, right? If you're trying to establish a goal, you're trying to establish purpose, and those types of more personal, intimate types of deals. It's not a P&L or making the Q or the K or what have you, right? From a business aspect, it's personal growth and satisfaction. And how do you listen to yourself, identify that, and take actions to achieve that? Because I think, to the power leadership individual out there, like, I think there's a lot of regret at some point. I mean, I certainly look back at, the last decade of my life and went, what the hell did
mhm,
I do? Like,
mm,
I mean, that's why we're here, right? This is my way of combining experience and purpose and
mhm.
unifying it into something that I think will benefit people, humanity, if you will. So if you have anything to talk to that, I think, I certainly would appreciate it. Hopefully our listeners will too.
Yeah, well, at one point I wrote about the retirement reflex.
Yeah.
In
Okay.
other words, when people finally step down
Yeah.
and they realize a buddy of mine who was CEO of a major financial dental network said to me, I no longer have the Sundays, right? his job every week was looking at the numbers and going out there and motivating all of his associates. He said, pretty much that's my job, is
Yeah.
to go out and motivate people. Um, and that was really stunning to me to hear him say that. And that he was now able to sort of see a little bit beyond that. One of the things I gave a talk on was in this really interesting thing they do up here in Illinois, and they've done all over the world. It's called Pacha, and it's a exactly 6 minute and 40-minute talk on one subject. And it started in Japan and it spread all over the whole world. And mine was on the wilderness of light. In other words, you can find wilderness everywhere you go if you realize light is a form of wilderness. When I walk through the canyons of Chicago and I look up at the buildings and I see the sun bouncing off from 93 million miles away and realize it's doing all these things, you're really in a wilderness of a sort, even though you're in a big city. And there is actually a canyon in Chicago where on a certain day of the year, the sun rises right up that line and
Mm.
people line up to see it come pour down the streets. So a lot of people feel nature's so far away, but that's a really quick example. The other thing that I kind of help people do is a lot of people, bird watching has taken off and bird feeding has taken off. And it's so simple and easy for most people. They have these Ring cameras now that you can set up that you
Yeah.
connect to with an app on your phone, and you can see these birds up close and people's jaw drops. I've got a longtime golfing friend who was a PR associate, and he's calling me every day. I've got this, I've got that. And I just love it because it's a whole new avenue to that.
Mm.
Um, and you don't need to feel embarrassed. Some people used to feel embarrassed to talk about nature. When I was in high school, they called me Birdman and they made fun of
Mm.
me, because all of us athletes were supposed to be macho and insensitive and all of that. But I was in
Right.
poetry club, I was a bird artist and all that. I just have never feared the bro simplex. And so I try to introduce people in ways uh, that make them feel comfortable with this idea that being interested in nature. And also one of the other books I wrote was about I've been a long time golfer. My dad was a golfer, and I wrote this book called Nature is Our Country Club
Yeah.
because one of the things that's happened out there, and I'm speaking not only to golfers, 10% of people in America golf, uh, but the other 90%, where's our country club, right?
Yeah.
So that's the title of the book. But I speak a lot to corporate people who go out to play golf because it is a really beautiful environment. On the other hand, however, it's not nature. It's a manufactured, rather homogeneous environment. So let's understand that. And what's transpired to save golf courses expenses over the last 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 years, is they've been incorporating more nature that requires less management, less expense, less mowing. And in some cases, it's saved golf courses hundreds of thousands of dollars. And when you think, that the average day, your goal is to get 300 golfers out there in the course to make your nut every day.
Right. Right.
There's pace and there's all this sort of thing.
Mhm.
So it's a bottom line thing. Nature is a bottom line benefit to that. But more importantly, golf courses used to be some of the most toxic environments on earth. And they're now changing that a little bit and are finding that less chemicals on the golf course is better for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Clearly. Clearly. I mean, common sense, not so common, but there's also a bottom line effect too, right? So
Well, some of those chemicals are identified as definite risks to
yeah.
people. And I'm not going to be specific about that because I
Yeah.
don't want to get into a contentious area.
Right.
But there are some definite risks. But the other thing is, I was playing golf with Doug Plank of the Chicago Bears one time on this corporate trip I organized. And I looked around at the golf course in Arizona and I go, how much water a day does it take to keep this place green? He goes, 1 million gallons a day. So there's 365 million gallons, and there's like what 50, 60 golf courses in Arizona. So little things like how to save water or
Yeah.
repurpose it are important. And so I've also tried to use my background in the corporate world and that sort of thing, speak to people in basically kind and directive fashion that let's be aware. Because if you love golf, it matters. During COVID, it burst back up after years of golf courses going out of business. Golf returned because people could go out there. And so we've had sort of a reformation of sort in the
Hmm.
golf world. I like that. I'm not a heavy duty golfer, but I play 6 to 10 times a year, and I enjoy it. And I shoot in the mid 80s. I've never been any better or any worse than that.
Yeah, I think being from Hawaii, I'm always every time I go home when I visit family, it's inevitably there's a golf game on the books. So I golf maybe once or twice a year, and I
Yeah.
if I break 100, I'm happy. But it's
Well, and
nice to get
that's
out.
good.
Yeah,
But it is nice to get out, and the companionship and golf courses are beautiful. Now, while I've said that they're sort of an engineered environment, they're important green spaces in a lot of places in this country. And when I go out, I used to caddy too, which I never liked, but people often didn't know what they were seeing. And when I'm in Southern Hills golfing with my brother-in-law down in Florida, he'll go, "Well, what's that?" And it'll be like black-bellied whistling ducks. So what's that? It'd be wild turkeys. And so golf courses do provide a lot of important environment. And I grew up right next to one, and I used to go out with a 3 wood, a 7 iron, and a putter in my bare feet and 3 golf poles in my pocket, and play the course on rainy days because no one would chase me off. And it sort of built my cross country career because after that, I loved running on the golf course. But, long history there.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's again, and I even mentioned it earlier when we were talking about triathletes being in nature.
Mhm,
That's another game, right? Living in the present, not living in the
mhm,
past, being
mhm.
in the zone, right? So yeah, for you, I think that's kind of your I wouldn't call it an addictive behavior, but you do a lot of stuff like that, which is,
So
honestly,
I'm gonna mention that
yeah,
because while I think it's important to use the term addictive behavior because I
yeah,
was supremely focused on competitive running from the age of 12
yeah,
to the age of like 27.
mm,
And I was so tied up in my self-image with that at some point when I got married and we're going to have a child, I go, you know what? I think I need to change some of that because I'm going to have additional responsibilities, and some of these life changes are hard to come to grips with. And I had so many additional other interests. I knew I'd be happy. I wouldn't be missing it, but I did. I made a conscious change to go from being so focused on this running. I even
yeah,
took a year off where I was sponsored by a running store. I got all my shoes and all my race fees, and I raced 24 times and I won 12 of them. And so I did that in life, and I'm glad I did it
yeah,
so I didn't have to do it later in life, right? Because some of us get caught up in these things when we have like emotional crises in our 40s, like midlife and that sort of thing. And it's pretty easy to get carried away. So I kind of look at that from these days when I do triathlons. I go for the peak experience. And yes, sometimes I podium, but if I don't, I'm not there, woulda, coulda, shoulda, or
yeah,
blaming myself.
yeah.
And
Do you,
don't you think, I was going to ask you, don't you
yeah,
think it applies somewhat in business too?
in terms of like making sacrifices and just taking your foot off the gas and pivoting, and is that what you're referring
Yes,
to?
yes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the world in which we live, right? If you're
Mhm,
not changing or at least assessing something, right? Market,
mhm.
employees, strategy, what have you, that's a recipe to run off a cliff if you're not careful, right?
Yeah.
But I think we're really good as a society, or at least maybe in the circles that I'm familiar with, at doing it with an object, an entity, an enterprise. I don't think we're good at doing it for self,
Mhm.
right? And I you could argue with me about that. Like for instance, I think AI is such a contentious topic as an
Mhm.
example, right?
Mhm.
Like there's a lot of conviction as it going to be, the savior, it's going to be great for society. And I don't necessarily argue its potential, but what's the probability and likelihood of another outcome? And are we
Mhm.
looking at that and challenging that? And I use it. I mean, I love it.
Mhm.
I think there's some great things that it can bring out, but I also think that maybe a little humility and the ability to, take the cart in a different path, or maybe make sense or not. And I know in your book you talk a little bit about this, right? Or
Mhm.
it's more of a generalist term, but yeah, I'd love to maybe unpack this a little bit if you'd like.
When I look at And I've used AI recently, as an illustrator artist. I have often done my own work,
Yeah.
hand drawn it or painted it, whatever. But I was doing some curriculum materials because I do a lot of teaching, and I've learned that there's this new movement called STEAM, which is incorporating English and art into classroom settings and actually integrating it between science and English and math and all
Yeah.
that. And so I wrote these children's stories and I did elementary level, but then I did a middle school one. And I thought, well, I could do these drawings, but they would take me either by hand or by illustration weeks. Or I could go into AI through Adobe Creative Suite. And I did each one of them in about 60 seconds.
Yeah.
And they came out fantastic. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay. And my son runs, he's an advisor uh, in admissions for getting
Mm.
kids into schools. And he has now created this platform for himself through AI that helps drive the questions with the students that they need to know. And it's sort of automated. And
Yeah.
he's read like 10,000 college essays. Uh, and knows now, kind of what some of the predictability is,
Yeah.
and helps students find that space for themselves in terms of what's their uniqueness and what do they need to say. So it kind of cuts through the cliche, which is the opposite of what people fear about AI,
Yeah.
is that too often it's being used for basically plagiarism purposes,
Mhm.
sort of,
Mhm.
or for quick modeling and not originality. And I've also been offered work where I go in and humanize AI writing.
Right.
I've done a lot of B2B
Right.
writing. And so I go in and I look at it and say, well, this sounds sterile and how can I improve it? But then I have a limited understanding still of what AI can do. And I think this is a parallel because there's also the fact that so much information's out there. And traditionally, people, Mark Twain said, in religion and politics, most people's opinions are gotten secondhand and unexamined. And we do that in a lot of things. And so some people are going to
Yeah.
take from AI kind of what they're told to
Right.
believe, and they're going to kind of engage with it there. But
Yeah.
then there are always the experimenters and the drivers, and they're going to be so far ahead of everybody. And that's kind of where we found ourselves about a year ago, right? There was so many new portals coming up,
Yeah.
and some of the people in the predictive industries were really scared that this was going to run away from us. And there are still people out there. Um, so my parallel would be okay, let's look at how we've encountered other important forms of information in history. And it brings me back to like reading the Bible in 90 days. What do you take from it? How do you process that information? And who are you going to trust to help you interpret it? And I think that's what's going to be the challenge. With the disruption of the entire news industry, I worked in the newspaper industry for a bunch of years before going to marketing. And people trusted newspapers and they sort of consumed information in a certain way. But as the internet came along, that whole paradigm shifted and people were reading shorter and shorter. And there are people who are really concerned that we've even evolved to lose some of our ability to internalize information properly or have the attention span.
Yeah.
Can AI help with that? Can we somehow get the information back that we really need
Right.
and that sort of thing? And I look for that. I think that would be a really interesting standpoint.
I I don't disagree with what you're saying. I just think
Mhm.
it's more who are the gatekeepers for that piece of information and how is it
Totally
driven. But
agree.
yeah, but in a vacuum, 100% I agree with you. Yeah, it's always fascinating to me when you read, older works, literary works, and then you kind of think about the modern day in which we live. Yeah, I definitely think attention spans and our ability to internalize and assess, digest, if you will, the topics are. It's, I don't think we're as good as we used to be. I think we're
Can I
evolving.
can I touch on that
Yeah,
gatekeeper point for a
yeah.
moment?
Oh yeah, please.
So, and this is for both people who have a religious background and people who don't,
Yeah,
because there's always gatekeepers on everything. And one of
yeah,
the examples that I saw over the years was looking at, what did Jesus do with the religious authorities of his day? And he challenged them about their method of controlling everything. And they considered themselves the only gatekeepers. And I really liked that he was willing to think outside the box and challenge that paradigm and call people into a kinder space, a more compassionate space, and one that was more in keeping rather than playing by the rules and following sort of and doing what you're told. Look at this. John the Baptist went on and said, just repent. And when you do, you're cleansed. And I think we have to be careful who we trust to be gatekeepers, to your point, on the AI front. And we need to examine those and be willing to challenge that. And what are they doing with it? And why are they doing what they do? So I guess I cite that example as a parallel. And don't be afraid to question. I think it's always important. I like that Ted Lasso phrase, be curious, not judgmental,
Yeah.
because it encourages us to not assume things about others, but also not to trust everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
is that kind of along the lines of what you were thinking about when you're talking about the gatekeepers?
Yeah, yeah, it's just, motive, right? And how that works, and then we being, the masses, if you will, having maybe a say in that direction, which we won't,
Right.
but it is what it is, right? So you have to kind of figure out how we all survive post, sentinel, if you will, right? And
Well,
but but maybe along that topic though, I mean, like as we
mhm.
talk about like leaderships or gatekeepers, right? Do you think leaders are given enough space to change their minds publicly? Or
Wow, I love that. I love that question. Um, I am going to share a quick anecdote that kind of illustrates how the difficulty position leaders sometimes put into,
yeah.
and how the role of ethics and honesty comes into play. I've done a lot of crisis management for people and public relations, and there was an organization that got phished. And if people don't understand phished, it means someone got into your internal network through basically it's like fishing for information.
Right.
And if someone sends that information out, it's not that your system was hacked, it's that someone distributed at a request. And this particular individual distributed everyone's personal data. So instantly, the organization's at risk for all these kinds of, uh, scams and all that
Mhm,
sort of things.
mhm,
So their initial reaction was to avoid going to the press. And I said, no, you need to get in front of this. You're under pressure right now, but it's worse if you hide. And sure enough, the press went to a different individual in the organization, kind of a parallel
mhm,
position, who said we got hacked. That's a different thing.
mm,
And so this whole idea that um, when you're in a leadership position, there are a lot of people that go through leadership training in terms of crisis management and how to handle the media, and there are extreme good examples of how to handle yourself in those situations. And so, to answer your question, yes, people are put in some really difficult positions at times, but it's most important to be preparatory in your reasoning and your leadership position and anticipatory than it is to be reactionary,
yeah,
because your emotions may run it rather than your reason and your priorities.
yeah, yeah, agreed,
But
agreed.
most of all, be honest, because as we've seen, it always gets worse. As soon as you tell something that's not true, then you're covering for your lie, and you often up make lies about that.
Yeah,
And that's where things get really bad. And
yeah,
we can go back through, and it's not one political persuasion or one religion or one anything that suffered this consequence. It's
yeah,
whenever people aren't honest that these problems come out. And if you look at, history, that's describes just about every kind of major problem that we have. And the culture wars and everything that's going on, it's all about these ethics and being honest about things. And my book says only honesty leads to goodness. So if we're all interested in goodness, secular, religious, political, personal, that sort of thing, our relationships, uh, the honesty, I think, leads it. And when I was going through things with my late wife, sometimes she would have a complaint. And I said, you know, honey, it's easier for me to handle a complaint if you write it down. I said, because sometimes complaint is a lack of respect. A lack of respect leads to lack of trust, and a lack of trust leads to lack of love. And so if we start from a point of love, then everything else falls into place and we can be honest with each other. And I think that goes within teams in companies that
Yeah.
I've worked with. If you are complaining about a client, for example, this just drive me nuts. Sitting in meetings and hearing people complain about our client, I go, wait, they're paying us to do a good thing for them, and we're complaining about them. I go, that's not respectful. And it will come out in a meeting if you aren't honest with them. So those are the kinds of things I've tried to help people appreciate about the importance of honesty.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. So, Chris, what's next for you? What?
So yeah, the interesting next project is way back in my early 20s, after I was an admissions counselor. I started writing a book, and it was all about the admissions process because what I saw amongst all these kids trying to make life decisions at the age of 18 was they had no idea what they wanted to do. And so I invented a character, and it was kind of like, you know, sometimes you have to be stupid enough to know what's good for you, right? That was sort of the premise of the book. And I wrote a whole bunch of things in this novel. And I thought, oh, okay. And I got going with line, and I kept processing it through different kinds of things. When I first started writing it, I wrote it longhand on legal paper, and then, you know, typed it out and then put it
Yeah.
into a Mac, and it went through all these iterations. Well, just recently, I pulled it out and I looked at it, and I'd say 90% of the things I wrote in the book came true. So it's the first novel that I'm looking to pursue and finish. I've written so much nonfiction, and
Yeah.
it's called Admissions, Edmissions.
Mm,
And because I do a lot of teaching, I've sort of refined it, but much of the writing was is intact. And so that's the one thing I'm pursuing, along with some of my art ventures. I'm trying to consolidate that career, that second career, you know, kind
yeah.
of semi-retired, into my writing and my art. And I also want to go out and speak with people about these subjects because there is a hunger for, I guess, insight or, and that's why I like what you're doing with this podcast, is there's a hunger out there for insight about what people are thinking about this modern environment we're in.
Yeah. Yeah. Appreciate that. So I'm going to take a little bit of a sidebar
Okay.
on our way to closing. We
Yeah.
have this round. We call it the special guest question round, right? So
Okay.
you get your turn, if you will, at the batting at the home plate to bat. But the question that our last guest asked of you is
Oh,
they basically would like to learn one lesson you've learned that propelled your thinking, career, etc.
wow. I love that. So here it is. I was in a youth group at in high school, and it was called I think it was called Campus Life. And I kept asking questions, and it was a Christian youth group, and I kept asking questions. And at one point, one of the counselors came up and says, "You know, if you don't stop asking questions, you'll never be a Christian." And I went, "Wow." Well, 10 years later, I was in a McDonald's, and I saw that guy, and he turned his head, and I went, "Wow." So I went over and I said, "Hey, let's sit down and talk." And I said, "I want you to know something, that if you turning your head was a product of something you shared with me 10 years ago, I go, I want you to know that didn't stop my journey." I said, "I am naturally a questioning person." And I go, "If there needs to be forgiveness exchanged here, let's do that." And so we did. And it was, for me, pretty life changing in some respect.
Like that.
And one more example of that is I had a conflict at work a few years later. And frankly, I'm a competitive person. I wanted to put my fist through this guy's face. But I went home that night and I walked out and over to the high school track, and I laid down, took off my glasses. It happened to be a cloudy night. And then while I was laying there, the word forgiveness popped in my head. And I got up and I looked around and I didn't see anybody. And I went, wow, okay. And so on the way home, I left in anger because I told my wife, I can't stay home around the kids. I need to go out and release this. And I came home and she looked at me. She goes, wow, what happened? I said, something major happened. And I went in and forgave that man the next day, and everything fell into place. Now, sadly, he was fired 2 weeks later, not because of me, but because we did that, we later restored our relationship. And I remain friends with that guy to this day. And I think that those two things combined are had big impact on me. And it
Yeah.
shows the importance of acceptance and that whole thing of maybe being competitively judgmental is a dangerous thing to do. So, do I come up with a
Great.
question now for the next person?
You do. Yeah.
Okay. So, that's interesting. So, the question I want to ask the next person is, do you ever keep a journal to track and process your life events and beliefs and hopes?
Yeah.
Because I'm curious about that, and I'd love to hear from other people because I keep journals, and sometimes I go back and look at them, and I go, okay, I was in a
Yeah.
ruminative space there. I could have handled that differently. But then I also discovered a lot of poetry I'd written and
Yeah.
things like that I'd forgotten about. So I'll be really curious to hear what the next person says.
That's great. Great question. Love,
Yeah.
love, love the insight, if you will, or the curiosity. Chris, it's been great. I mean, thank you so much for your time. I guess before we cut or before we go, I mean, how can our listeners, if they want to find your books, your works of art, your services, where can they go?
They're all on ChristopherCudworth.com. Last name Cudworth.com.
Okay,
And so there's portals to all my work there. And I
great.
appreciate this. I hope it's fruitful for people. I try to share it, as straightforward as I can. And I also encourage people, don't be afraid to reach out. I've had some amazing contacts over the years from people I didn't know before that
Yeah,
really are life changing too.
love it, love it. Again, I really appreciate your time. We'll put the information in the show notes where viewers can access it. And thanks again. Pleasure being with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being with you too.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye bye.